Oh, let's see what's on here.
It's the most dominating performance, period.
I don't think we've ever seen somebody compete like we saw.
Occasionally, sporting events can get out of hand.
He is moving like a tremendous machine. An amazing, unbelievable performance.
When everything is going the way of one team or one player, momentum takes its course and delivers what's known in sports as a blowout.
Unbelievable. I mean, every once in a while, you're like, oh, 50.
Simply remarkable that one individual was so much better than the 155 other players.
There's no rock-solid definition for what dictates a blowout compared to, say, a tough-fought game where one team was just in control the whole time. But I like to think you can kind of just know when you're watching a blowout. You can feel when one team is just getting outplayed versus when they're being brutally destroyed and are smaller, slower, and weaker than their opponents. These lopsided affairs of sport aren't exactly fan favorites. The league themselves know that close, good games sell better, and keeping at least a competitive atmosphere is always going to be in the best interest of everyone involved. However, sometimes a blowout storms past being an uninteresting, one-sided game and becomes something else entirely. At some mysterious point, again, there's no set margin, the very mold of the sport starts to unravel, and it turns into not a game, but an endeavor of embarrassment. And if we go back to this chart, once that threshold is crossed of a blowout becoming a vicious act of terror portrayed as a sport, well, interest starts to rise again. Humans, we're vile little creatures. In our nature, we just want to watch how bad it's gonna get. We don't care to see when a team is down by 28, but when they're down by 70, viewership spikes. We crave seeing them get to 80, then 90. It's sick, really, but it's in our blood, as callous as it is to want to watch excruciating beatdowns. We want to watch blowouts. The bigger, the better, with no true limit. So today, in this video, I want to take a look at these special instances of extreme domination and answer a simple question. Which game out of all sports is the single biggest blowout in history? I'll start by asking you that question. What do you think is the biggest or worst blowout? We'll come to see there's many definitions of how people interpret what the worst blowout should be, what it means, but I would imagine a lot of you have similar answers right now. If I was a betting man, I'd say the most common answer is this: 222-0. Cumberland vs. Georgia Tech, college football. Not a bad answer for a non-contextualist, I guess, but while it may shock you, Georgia Tech's ravaging was far from the worst ever seen in sports. It is, however, a behemoth of a game with such a reputation that it deserves its own spot. This, as is quickly gonna become normal here, is a score that just seems too dumb to be possible. Over 200 points in a football game is just silly. No NBA team has ever done that in basketball. Georgia Tech scored 32 touchdowns and forced 15 turnovers. It's not even video games, it's just numbers of legend passed on like myths. John Heisman, an architect of the game of football, was the victorious coach in this game, and it is undoubtedly and undeniably the biggest blowout in college football history. The game was in response to a 22-0 baseball loss that Georgia Tech had taken to Cumberland in the previous season, and it saw a number of moments that just don't seem like they can be possible. To be honest, the only question about this game that exists is what could possibly beat it. It's hard to grasp a score of 222-0 and just how large that is relative to normal football. But don't you worry, I promise, by the end of this video, you'll know of a game and a day far more horrific than anything here. Now, I was careful earlier to say this is the undisputable biggest college football blowout. That may sound weird, but there's a whole different school of thought some people have about this question, and that comes from our next game. You see, ESPN themselves had the 222-0 game at just 5th on the ranking of the biggest sports blowouts ever. But even more shocking, number 1 was another football game. And that game didn't even have as many points. In 1940, the Chicago Bears took it to the Washington Redskins with an NFL record 73-0 commanding shutout win. Now, in the same sport of football, why could a 73-0 win even be in the same conversation as a 222-0 win? It's literally a third of the destruction, and while that's true, this introduces us to a separate group of people that some of you may happen to identify with. These are the contextualists. You see, the Bears' win wasn't just in any game. This 73-0 clobbering came in the NFL Championship of 1940, the biggest game of the year with the supposed best football teams that exist, and the Bears won 73-0, the biggest NFL blowout ever, period. And so, when taking the full context into account, the importance of this game, some do believe that this is a more impressive blowout, ESPN included. Now, whatever your opinion, this is a very rare blowout, and an awesome one at that. Chicago went into this game having lost to this very same Redskins team earlier in the regular season. After that game, Redskins owner George Preston Marshall, who famously didn't want any colored person on his team, called out the Chicago Bears for being crybabies and quitters when the going got hard. He of course had no idea that he would eventually face Chicago again in the championship, and this quote reportedly served as ripe motivation for Bears players leading up to the game, so much so that on the field pregame to hype his team up, Bears coach George Halas held up the newspaper with the quote on it. On the second play of the game, Chicago broke a 68-yard touchdown, in big thanks to this monster two-person blindside block. But Washington calmly drove back down the field and set themselves up. Unfortunately, receiver Charlie Malone would drop a surefire touchdown pass, then Washington would miss a field goal and come up scoreless. And things just never looked back. It was 28-0 at halftime, and Chicago had not done near their worst yet. Not long into the second half, the Bears sat their starters. It didn't stop anything. The Bears came out and got 3 pick sixes in the third quarter alone. The current Bears have just 2 pick sixes in the last 3 years. 45 points were put up in the second half. In 1940, there were no nets behind goalposts, so as the teams were running out of balls because of all the touchdowns the Bears scored, the referees and Redskins had to ask the Bears to stop kicking PATs and run a play for the conversion instead. As it ended with 73 points put up, it is still, to this day, the highest scoring NFL game ever, much less playoff and championship game. And it was a shutout at that. They didn't just score 73, they won by 73, and there's never really been a championship game like this in any other sport. Of course, this was a while ago, same as the 222-0 game. A player literally went through this one starting at defensive end and did not wear his helmet, because he didn't have to. A long time. So, to transition from the home of contextualism, I want to take a look at a much more recent example of utter destruction of peers in a sport. And for that, we have to go back about 23 years ago. In the 2000 US Open, played in Pebble Beach, Tiger Woods entered the field as already the best golfer on the planet, but what he was about to do would cement a legacy of all-time great status. Fittingly, aging golf legend Jack Nicklaus was also in the field for what would be his last US Open he ever competed in. And Tiger, in front of the greatest golfer of all time to many people, went out and did this. Woods came into the first round hot, but not quite on fire. He took the first place lead, but after 2 days of golf, he was only a stroke up. Then, things started to spiral. The next couple days, weather wasn't ideal on the links. Not bad enough to cancel play, but bad enough to affect everyone golfing. Everyone except Tiger Woods. He ripped birdie after birdie. On hole 6, he sort of pioneered a now semi-popular approach to the hole where you have to nail the ball over the ocean and a cypress tree. It's a really tough shot for most people, and you can hear the announcers seeing it for the first time pulled off. They're just in awe.
It's just not a fair fight. No, it really isn't, Roger. I mean, that is phenomenal. My question is, how do you beat that? I mean,
He capped the second round off 6 strokes ahead of the rest of the field, a US Open record for a day 2 lead, but he wasn't done. Round 3 is the toughest on Pebble Beach, and while Tiger struggled, everyone else just struggled a lot more, and he kept extending his lead. After a bogey on 8, Tiger went to hole 9, needing to balance himself out. Hole 9 is known as the toughest hole on this entire course, and it's universally feared. It was right here that Tiger put his big boy pants on and birdied the hardest hole on the course with a long putt through the wind, eventually helping him keep an even par for the round. So while Tiger still stood at 8 under for the whole tournament after 3 rounds, the rest of the field had tumbled way down, giving Tiger Woods a 10-stroke lead going into the final round. It was a formality. He couldn't lose the tournament if he tried to. But right here, with a dominating lead and time remaining, this is where we separate the schoolyard blowouts from the annihilating massacres. This is where you either let the gas off, or, as my middle school basketball coach would say, you take your foot that's already on their neck and you stomp down on it.
I was 13.
As you can imagine, for his inclusion on this list, Tiger Woods didn't let his foot off. He didn't hit these spectacular double eagles. That wasn't what did it for him. He didn't need to. Tiger played consistent, near perfect golf, hole after hole, hitting par or a birdie on everything in his path. It was and still is the greatest golf ever played. That statement backed by various credible people. No one has ever had a better stretch of days in a golf tournament than Tiger did. An unholy 15-stroke win was what it ended at. The only player to shoot below par, and he was 12 under. It's the largest defeat in any major tournament, obviously, and Tiger's hot hand would only continue, probably peaking here, but winning 3 more majors after this for a near Grand Slam. This was relatively early in Tiger's career, but that week at Pebble Beach was probably the ultra prime of his golfing life, and he was hotter than any golfer ever had been during it. That's what it took to create one of the most one-sided and impossibly far apart blowouts of all time. And honestly, if you think this is the biggest blowout ever, that's respectable. It's not my choice, but it's hard to definitively prove that opinion wrong or right just with the differences in sports. I mean, stacking up Tiger's performance to the 222-0 route, where do you even start? Say an average football game is won by 14 points, and an average golf tournament is won by maybe a stroke and a half. These are very subjective numbers, and we'll be getting more concrete later, but for this set, Tiger Woods won by 10 times a normal golf score, and the Cumberland football team won by almost 16 times a normal football score. Now, we're going to get deeper and more precise. This is just a little taste, but there's a couple more blowouts that have strong cases for the best. So let's take a look at what the sport of basketball has to offer. I'm not giving this one a select entry or any certain game because I'm not going to lie to you guys, there just hasn't been anything that holds a toe. I did want to make sure to mention the sport itself, though, and see some of the biggest blowouts it has to offer. But as you'll see, only one of these stories really deserves to be brought up in the conversation, and it's more of a what if than anything else. First off, looking NBA blowouts, it's real slim pickings, with probably the most boring blowouts of any major pro sport. The Grizzlies' 76-point defeat of the Thunder is the worst in NBA history, and is actually the most recent in this whole video, happening in just 2021. But this game doesn't scream ugly. I mean, 152 is a lot of points, but it's not like mind-shattering unheard of. Memphis scored about 40 a quarter. They didn't even have a single player get 30 points. What's especially interesting about this game is that the Thunder were pretty bad this year, yeah, but the Grizzlies weren't that good either. They barely made the playoffs, and their best player did not play this game. Ja Morant was hurt. Just such a weird circumstance to set the biggest blowout in NBA history mark, but it's definitely a very breakable record to me. As for other realms of basketball, there's interesting tidbits, but nothing too noteworthy. We could talk about the United States consistently winning Olympic basketball games by video game scores, but that's almost normal. And there's that kid that scored 138 points, albeit in a D3 game, but even his team only won by 75. Okay, how about Troy State DeVry? This is a respectable blowout, I'll give you that. 253 to 141, that pops out at you. And while a 112-point win is impressive, I wouldn't call it the worst ever. One of the best offensive explosions, sure, but they allowed 141 points too. They couldn't stop a thing and didn't really care to. That's not the one-sided domination we're looking for. The basketball game that almost deserves a spot and therefore got the picture on the wall, well, it breaks my own rules. I said no high school sports, but just this one, because it had the potential and basketball just doesn't have anything better. In a high school girls basketball game, future WNBA star Lisa Leslie scored 101 points. Even more bizarre, her team finished with 102 points, scoring just a single free throw that Leslie didn't put in the hoop. But none of that is near the worst part. The kicker? All of that was in the first half. I do not care what level, or against what opposition, or who you are, 101 points in a half of basketball is possibly the most horrifying act of utter dominance one can commit on hardwood floors. There is no excuse, there are no reasons, whys, or buts. This is refined modern assault. The score was 102 to 23 as the teams went to their locker rooms. At some point in the half, the opposing team just started fouling Lisa Leslie, figuring they had a better shot of her missing free throws than they did stopping her. But the hack-a-shack strategy proved ineffective as she made 27 free throws in the half. Lisa made 37 shots, and keep in mind, girls high school basketball had 8-minute quarters. That is 101 points in 16 minutes, about 6 points a minute. No three-pointers either, just 37 buckets. And after all that, understandably, the opposing team never came back out of the locker room after halftime. The game was called with a clear winner, but this premature forfeit really screwed everyone over. For one, this thing was on track to be a 150-point plus blowout. That's something I want to see for this video, but poor Lisa Leslie, she was 4 points away from the single-game girls' points record, and I think it's safe to say she was due for at least 5 in the second half. But because some 15-year-old girls couldn't take the buckets raining on their heads, we are robbed of what could have been the greatest blowout in basketball history. That leaves this one as kind of a what if in those terms, but don't worry. Our next blowout leaves no debate. This is exactly what it looks like to be the undisputed greatest at your sport, and it can be captured in a single image. That single picture, while showing the essence of domination, truly doesn't begin to describe just what Secretariat did to the field that day. To quote ESPN's Ron Flatter, "Seldom does performance match excessive expectation." With just 6 words, that sentence says a shocking amount about sports and the hype we generate for them. Oftentimes, athletes that are hyped up to the max, pegged to be the next great thing, they tend to crumble. That intensive amount of pressure is not something just any man or woman can handle, but luckily for America, Secretariat was a horse. The outside forces that haunt many athletes, partying, irresponsibility, drugs, emotions in general, they're not as big factors in a horse. Maybe that's why it was possible, or maybe it was just pure skill in being so far beyond his competition. Whatever it was, all of America was behind Secretariat as he chased horse racing's first Triple Crown in 25 years. He had won the first 2 races with ease, and with a country riding on him, wanting and needing to see him win, the 1973 Belmont Stakes arrived. Secretariat was the overwhelming favorite. People didn't just want to see a win, they wanted to see him crush the field. And as rarely happens in sports, Secretariat didn't just match expectations. He exceeded beyond anyone's wildest imaginations. The race got started, and it wasn't over from the go. Secretariat got out sprinting, but with a meager start, he was around the 4th place mark out of the gates. Through the first straightaway, every horse is at near full speed, but Secretariat starts to close on the lead rather quickly. By the first turn, Secretariat is right up alongside Sham for the lead. They stay even for a while. Sham even looks like he might pull away at a couple points. The two really start to pull away from the rest of the field. They open a lead of around 10 lengths between everyone else, but there's still a lot of race left. It's around this point, though, that we start to separate the greats from the legends. Over the course of just a few strides, Secretariat pulls his lead to about 1.5 lengths. Then he opens it to 3 lengths, then 5. Then, as you're realizing he's pulling away, Secretariat has a 10-length lead. The camera begins to zoom out and out and out, but it can barely pick up 1st and 2nd place in the same shot. He still has not stopped accelerating since he passed. It's tough to even quantify his lead at this point, maybe 15 lengths. Sham starts to drop from 2nd place, probably because he tried to keep up with Secretariat for so long, but don't get it twisted. This is not the field catching up to Secretariat. This is Sham slowing. No one is posing a threat right now. Opposing riders have a POV something like this, and they probably struggled to even see Secretariat's tail without losing focus. The lead is nearly 20 lengths as Secretariat reaches the home stretch. Everyone in the stadium is on their feet, jumping up and down. This is the people's champion. And this is pure, unadulterated supremacy. You wish he eased up near the end. No, he's still pulling away, just as fast as before. It's gotta be 25 lengths now. They give up on trying to get the other horses in view, as Secretariat storms through the finish, still accelerating. Initially, it was called at 25 lengths, but that number is later corrected to 31. This iconic picture was snapped right next to the finish, and just might come up in the dictionary when you look up Blowout. It took less than 30 seconds after the race ended for it to be referred to as
They run the most sensational Belmont Stakes in the history of this race.
the 1.5 mile track was ripped through in 2 minutes and 24 seconds flat, still a record to this day, and 2 full seconds ahead of 2nd place. There's no denying this hits flowers as one of the greatest blowouts ever, and probably the greatest by a non-human. No animal has dominated the rest of its own species like this since the Megalodon, where official records weren't even tracked yet. Secretariat took a country expecting the impossible out of him and somehow satisfied each person and more, delivering better than anyone bargained for. He kinda naturally falls in with Tiger Woods here, cause it's just so tough to compare the sports of golf and horse racing to anything else. And while I respect the opinion if you think this is the worst blowout ever, I still think I might be able to change your mind by the end of this video. For our next contestant though, let's take it back to a mainstream sport and see what baseball has to offer in terms of clobberings. Pro baseball, as it often is a bit of an outlier to this list. For as long and as overly recorded as the MLB's history is, there's never really been a game that pops out as colossally one-sided. Dating back over 120 years, the worst loss suffered in an MLB game was 30-3, the Rangers taking it to the Orioles. 30 is crazy, that's a lot of runs, but relative to what's up here, 30 seems like child's play. I mean, they scored 30 runs, Secretariat won by 31 lengths. There are levels to this. The MLB doesn't hold too much weight to the real big boys. Even prehistoric baseball in the 1800s only ever saw 36 runs at most. This is a bit of a disappointment to me, to be honest. Baseball is an untimed sport. The possibilities for suffering are endless. One team could start raking bomb after bomb and theoretically nothing could stop them, and the game could go forever. And we saw this effect play out a little bit in that Rangers-Orioles blowout. Over 9 innings of a baseball game, for the Rangers to score 30 runs, we would expect a distribution something like this, about 3 runs an inning. But oddly enough, the Rangers only scored it all in less than half of the innings they went up to bat. Baseball is so statistically against you that they scored more runs than anyone has in 120 years, and they still failed over half the time. The unpredictability and streakiness of the sport, while allowing for these pockets of high scores, is also exactly what blocks baseball from being able to create a truly devastating blowout. But there was one baseball game that, kinda like a Little League game, one team was just way better than the other one. Lincoln, Nebraska. Buck Belzer Stadium, just a couple short blocks away from the glorious God's gift that is Mum's Liquor Store. Nebraska had Chicago State come into town for a doubleheader. They went out and killed them in the first game, 15-1. After a performance like that, it's gotta be hard for Chicago State to even strap up and play the second game, knowing you're likely gonna see a similar outcome. But they did play it. At the end of the third inning, it was 23-0. By the fourth, Chicago scored 34-2. The sixth inning, 50-3. 50 runs in 6 innings. And they called the game there. Nebraska was on track to score up to 70 runs. There's very little video of this game. These are all clips from an old SportsCenter segment on it. That's all I could find, but it could probably be used as evidence in some sort of crime if it existed. With over 7 runs an inning, Nebraska smashed every Division I record. Runs scored, margin of victory, RBIs, it was silly. Nebraska football was very good this year in 1999, like 3rd in the country, 12-1 record good. Nebraska football never reached 50 points in a game this year. A mediocre baseball team was never outscored by a top football team in the nation. 50 runs in baseball is tough to beat in any sport. That easily matches up with even 222-0, relatively speaking. I have just one more sport to look at, to tease you guys with, and to round out the list. Let's take a trip to the ice. For such a low-scoring game, hockey does have its share of routes, and I of course want to start by looking through the records of the NHL. And there's one blowout that stands above the rest here. 1944, the Red Wings and Rangers play. The game doesn't start crazy, it's 2-0 after the first period. Now, you already know to be on this list, an onslaught is coming, but I mean, sorta. It gets pretty ugly in the second, with the Red Wings scoring 5 more goals to put it at 7-0 going into the final period. That's a blowout, yeah, but it doesn't seem otherworldly. Then the floodgates definitely opened in the third. They doubled their score, pushing to 15 goals and maintaining the shutout. as the final seconds ticked off the clock with the Red Wings up 15-0. An infamous would-be 16th goal slid in just after the final buzzer sounded, not officially counting, but serving as one last needle to the heart. In the middle of the third period, the score was like 10-0, and Red Wings forward Sid Howe, who hadn't scored yet this game, decided he wanted to get in on the action. He proceeded to score 3 goals, an entire hat trick, in the final 8 minutes of the game. And everybody was eating too. All but 2 Detroit Red Wings players tallied a point on the night. The Rangers got just 9 shots on goal, and each of them was easily saved. This is a textbook beating. And at 15-0, it's the biggest blowout in NHL history. But doesn't this seem a tad bit underwhelming? I mean, we watched Tiger obliterate the best golfers in the world. Secretariat showed in under 2 minutes exactly what a blowout is. Georgia Tech scored 222 goddamn points. Does a 15-goal game really stack up? Why am I even including this on the list? Well, I guess you can call it a reference point. The biggest blowout in NHL history. 15-0. Huh. That is lopsided, but no. Hockey. It's a funny sport. The biggest blowout in sports history is a hockey game. It's not any of these. Please, 15-0, what do you think of me? No. The biggest blowout in sports history. Well, what if I told you it's been right in front of your face this whole time? Sandwiched in between Poland and Hungary, there's a mid-sized Slovak-speaking country where a drop of Disney magic just happened to hit. It's 2008, but already Winter Olympics buzz is in the air, despite there being 2 years until the Vancouver Games. Of the many aspiring athletes, many countries around the world, Slovakia included, are trying to field the best men's and women's ice hockey teams as humanly possible. And already, qualifying matches to secure a spot in the Olympics have begun. I cannot stress to you enough that these teams are comprised of a country's best players. They are doing all they can within their nation to put out the maximum quality of hockey. So, alright, what was it? The NHL game. 15-0? Do we want to take any bets for this one? To 0. A professional Olympic qualifying tournament sanctioned by the IIHF. 82-0. Do you understand what that is? Let me show you. The losers of this game, the victims to this beautiful monstrosity, was Bulgaria. As they watched every single one of those 82 goals reach the back of the net, they skated out to face off and kept playing. They didn't need to shorten their game or come to a mercy rule like some do, even though it was a question 5 minutes into the game. These women know they were resilient. I don't even know what it takes to stay on the ice out there. And yes, this is women's ice hockey. And yes, this is the biggest blowout in sports history. Man or woman, I do not care. Please look at the facts with me. Most amazing of all, this was caught on camera. We can relive every second of trauma alongside the Bulgarians. Slovakia didn't waste any of their time messing around or getting out slow. The score was 7-0, 5 minutes in the game. In just 300 seconds, Slovakia scored more goals than half of NHL teams have in a whole game this year. Slowing down? Never heard of her. No. It was 19-0 after 10 minutes. That is 12 more goals in 5 more minutes. That's another goal every 25 seconds. By the end of the first period, the score was 31-0, double any NHL blowout ever, and the game is 33% done. You can watch them skate around effortlessly. If I didn't tell you, you may think it was a youth team against a professional team or something. You have to remember, this is for the Olympics. Anyone in Bulgaria who can skate was probably invited. Nothing got better. Nothing improved. Slovakia came out hard, and not one time did they ease their foot off the gas. It was a slow, methodical, calculated march directly into the hearts of their enemy to promptly rip that heart out and stomp on it. The words mercy and pity were nothing but meaningless arrangements of letters, unable to do anything to stop this. 24 more goals in the second period. And the story of the night might have been that Bulgaria's goalie was still in the game. The starting one, the same one that had allowed every goal. 37 more goals in the third period brought us to our perfect total, a number so preposterous that outside of maybe football, any sport with this score is unreal. Nowhere on the planet should this be normal or allowed or possible. 12 different players scored hat tricks for Slovakia. They had a 10 and a 9 goal scorer. The announcer for the game had to say every goal and who scored it in multiple languages, causing him to struggle more than any of the players in the game. Even funnier than that, listen to this radio broadcast who had to shout out a law firm that sponsored the radio station for every single goal.
Legal and injury settlement advice, call 868-555-LAWW. Reardon, Ryerson, Smithson, and Smythe Law Firm is on you. 3-0. Okay. Slovakia pouring it on. Goals, Reardon, Ryerson, Smithson, and Smythe Law Firm for free legal and injury settlement advice. Call 1-868-55. Fourth goal, too, is brought to you by Reardon, Ryerson, Smithson, and Smythe Law Firm. Call 868-555-LAWW. What is the second W for? Reardon, Ryerson, Smithson, and Smythe Law Firm on your side. Is that the fifth or sixth goal? Wow, 6-0. Goals brought to you by Reardon, Ryerson, Smithson, and Smythe Law Firm. They're getting their money's worth for free legal and injury.
With just minutes left in the final period, when the score was 77-0, Bulgaria finally made the inexplicable choice to pull their goalkeeper. But instead of putting their backup in, no, they put an extra attacker, leaving an open net down 77. Slovakia quickly scored 2 more times, and then Bulgaria subbed in the backup goalkeeper. Slovakia quickly scored 3 more times on the backup before the game finally ended. As it came to a close, the impossible to imagine emotions of losing something in this fashion understandably took over. A fight broke out on the ice, and I'd like to think I would be fighting too. Slovakia ended the game scoring a goal every 44 seconds on average. They outshot Bulgaria 139-0. Yes, Bulgaria did not record a single shot, and Bulgaria's starting goalie let in 77 goals on 134 shot attempts, gathering 57 saves on the day. Okay, don't blame the goalie, that's a hard day's work. In fact, if you want someone to blame the Bulgarian government for putting this team out in legit sanctioned tournaments. There were not a lot of hockey players in Bulgaria, especially female, and this loss was obviously the worst one, but not the only rough go that the Bulgarians' women national team had. This was the third game of a 4-game tournament. Bulgaria went 0-4, losing to Italy 41-0 and to Latvia 39-0. But their final game had some hope. They were able to even get on the board against Croatia, a team that clearly needed defensive help. Croatia scored 30 goals though, so how does it stack up to the rest of the worst blowouts ever? 82 goals in a hockey game, 222 points in a football game. Personally, just seeing this, 82 jumps out a bit more for me for its sport, but let's get down to the nitty-gritty. NFL teams in modern times average right around 22 points a game, whereas modern NHL teams average about 3.25 goals a game. Plugging those numbers in, we get quite the discrepancy. Georgia Tech put up exactly 10 times an average NFL score, a remarkable feat in any sport. But Slovakia went 25 times an average NHL score. Okay, let's be real friendly to football, in case you think I inflated the numbers at all. And, maybe different leagues are higher or lower, college football versus women's Olympic hockey, there's some fluctuation. So, average NHL score, let's bump it to 5 goals a game. Most people will agree that is way too high. Average NFL score, let's take it all the way down to 15, lower than we have literally ever seen. Adjusting for even these unrealistic values that favor football, the hockey game still proves to be the bigger blowout relative to its sport. Now, with both these games, they're shutouts. That's a big plus to me in terms of a blowout. Having a 0 on that other scoreboard matters. I would rather lose a game 45-10 than 30-0. Even if I'm losing by more, at least I put up something. It was a competition. The shutout factor just adds a whole nother layer of hurt on a blowout. This is tough for the Nebraska-Chicago State baseball game. 50 is a crazy amount of runs, but they allowed 3. That's a bad mark. Based off MLB score averages, the Slovakia hockey game once again is the far bigger blowout, and that's without even taking the 3 runs scored into account. No basketball game is really worthy of this comparison, and again, it's not real fair to do this with Tiger Woods or Secretariat. I'm confident in saying this hockey game was a bigger blowout than 222-0. I mean, it was 100 years ago, the forward pass couldn't even drink yet, it was against a bunch of law students and frat bros, many of whom didn't know how to play football. It's great circumstances for an awesome rout, but no, that's not bigger than this hockey game. I can write off Nebraska baseball's historic win too. Again, probably the best of the best in its sport, but it doesn't hold up out here. A Division I sporting powerhouse trampled a barely D1 school, and yeah, it's awesome. I love looking at it, but it's just not quite this. Bulgaria is a country with 7.5 million people at the time, and they were tasked with making the best women's hockey team they could out of that. The very best product they put out was beaten by 82 goals. Sure, they got beat up by a lot of teams, but nothing within half of what Slovakia drenched upon them. And if you're still saying the Bears' 73-0 win is more impressive, well, I probably won't be able to change your mind. Alright, it was the NFL championship. Good for them. Slovakia also outscored them in the game of hockey. Just straight up plain outscored. You get 6 points for scoring in football. These are on different planets in different galaxies. There's nothing quite like Slovakia's win. This brings us to podium, the 3 blowouts that I truly feel are the most spectacular, most dominating one-sided affairs in sports history. A golfer, a horse, and an ice hockey team walk into a bar. Deciding which one of them leaves victorious is not an easy task. Again, I could say an average PGA tournament is won by a stroke, and an average Triple Crown race maybe by 4 lengths. Like, it just gets too touchy. That doesn't feel fair to base this all off of. One fair way to go about this is to look at second place. Each of these events are undoubtedly the peak of control and performance in their sport, so what's the next best? Well, for horse racing, the next best Belmont performance would be Easy Goer, who set the second fastest track time 2 seconds behind Secretariat. Easy Goer won his race by just 8 lengths to Secretariat's 31, but we've seen some other horses win Belmont by as much as 25 lengths too, giving us a solid anchor to compare Secretariat to at the least. In golf, Tiger Woods' win was like nothing ever seen before, but people have gotten close. His 15-stroke win is first all-time for major tournaments, with second place coming in just 2 strokes behind at 13. This was old Tom Morris, way back in 1862 with the Open. Tiger was leaps and bounds ahead of the field, but guys have been at least in that area before. As for international hockey, the closest thing we have is Australia's 58-0 win over New Zealand in 1987. At least someone got within half, but they didn't get within 3/4, and more reasonably, they scored 23 less goals than Slovakia did. A whole valley still separated these two games. Australia walked through that game, but as silly as 58-0 is, they frankly weren't that close to 82. And that alone is absolutely astonishing. It, as much as is possible, puts into perspective how much 82 goals is. And because of how much further away it is than anything else in hockey history, I see no problem in confidently putting it above Tiger Woods and above Secretariat. So, for all those reasons why, Slovakia's 82-0 ice hockey win against Bulgaria is the biggest blowout in sports. Thank you.